Is there any adjustments to the agenda? Different. All right, seeing none, then I would like to introduce Tom Getzel, who is the NSBA Executive Director. And he's with us tonight. Nicole and I had lunch with him in Chicago a few weeks ago and invited him to come visit us. You're up to honor us, what school?
Yesterday,
Yesterday.
they showcased Hazen
Yes.
Union High School at an event which Tom will speak about. And I think makes it his mission to visit all the school board associations when he can, and is
Yeah, I'd
doing a
love to
little
get
New
out.
England tour this
Yeah,
week.
yeah, thank you, and it's good to be here, and I'm going to just sort of hang around for the meeting, soak it all up, but thank you. First of all, thank you for your awesome executive director. She is such a delight to work with. And,
We agree.
You're very lucky, and we are too. I want to thank you too, because I'll just talk about this event yesterday that NSBA sponsored up on Capitol Hill. We call it one of our thought leader events. Our Center for Public Education, you may have heard about that, that's our research arm at NSBA, just released a report, and it's right on the front page of our website, nsba.org. It's called Busting the Myth about one-size-fits-all public schools. So this notion that public schools haven't changed forever, that students are sort of forced into this uniform system, we know is not true. So we looked at some data that the U.S. Department of Education had, actually a database that really hadn't been mined before, and it had some really interesting findings, which was that public schools generally have far more options for students than private schools, and that's true even for many of the public schools and high schools that are serving high proportions of students living in poverty and other challenges. So the message, I think, is that collectively we probably haven't told our story well enough because public schools are changing. And so we wanted to release that report, but we didn't want to just use data. We wanted to actually have some actual examples. So Hazen Union, right? We reached out to our members, the state associations, and said, can you suggest the names of some districts? And we had a lot of responses, so that was really great. But we could only pick 3 of them. So Hazen was picked. We had a rural district from here in Vermont. We had a suburban district from outside of Columbia, South Carolina. And then we had the Wichita Public Schools in Kansas, a pretty good sized urban district. And they all have just these really great stories to tell about personalized learning and individualized instruction for students, and just a lot of supports to ensure that students are successful. And we wanted to do that because we wanted to kind of put a face on this, so it wasn't just national data, but they could actually see some districts that are doing these things. Now, it was, you know, as my mother would have said, it was a happy problem to have more districts suggested than we could use on the panel. But as part of our Stand Up for Public Schools campaign and other places, we're going to be able to share all of these stories and try to just help people understand that. So all of which is to say that this is part of a larger national discussion, obviously, that's taking place about education, including issues around choice, but funding and a lot of other questions. And we just wanted to start the conversation, because it's just beginning, I think, really, with a clear understanding of what public education is in the country and what we're doing and the changes that are taking place. So thank you for that. It really was an awesome panel, and John Craig, who's I think the associate principal at that school, was really phenomenal. He was really good. And so it was neat, and the audience, by the way, it was a room, I mean, larger than this, it wasn't a huge room, but it was right up on Capitol Hill, and it was packed, and we had some other education groups there. We had some news media there. We had a lot of congressional staff, and we were really hoping to get them in. I was telling Nicole, I think it was a good topic in the fact that we had donuts and coffee. If you're a 20-some-year-old staff member, you come for that. But in any event, they stayed. They had a lot of good questions. They took with them a lot of information. So that's a great example, I think, of how NSBA can be effective, because as you know, you're the members of the state associations, and the way I describe us is as your Washington office. The one reason we're there is to represent your interest in Washington. Some of you know me for a while, many of you probably don't, but I spent a long time, over 32 years at the Pennsylvania School Boards Association, including 11 years as state exec. So I'm really sort of heavily focused on state organizations and the work that you do. And Nicole was telling me you're out on the road now doing your regional meetings, and I spent a lot of years in the car driving around Pennsylvania. But that's where your connection with members are, and that's where you can hear what people are thinking and get good feedback. And that's why I appreciate these opportunities to come out and just spend a few minutes. I thought I'd just talk for a minute or two, and then I know you have a long agenda, but I just wanted to comment on a few other things that we're focused on. I think the big issue for us really is kind of writ large, the whole question of equity and how we deal with meeting student needs, broadly speaking. I mean, for one thing, we know that the face of public education, the face of America, quite frankly, is changing. The demographics are changing. And certainly we know that the needs of students are changing. It's a sad commentary, but it's unfortunately the truth that we have a lot of kids in public education who are living in poverty, who come to school with a lot of challenges that public education has a responsibility to help address. So the work around equity is one of the things that we're spending a lot of time focusing on, and that includes issues around immigration, around transgender students, all the rights that students should have, and the ways that public education can meet those needs. We're also, of course, working as best we can to try to build a working relationship with the Trump administration. I won't mislead you, this is not easy work. But we obviously have some serious disagreements with them around issues, some of the obvious ones, I guess. But I would say that we're also continuing to be very focused on implementing ESSA, which was really a landmark piece of legislation. And to do that, we need to have a good relationship with the department. And now I did have a good meeting with the Assistant Secretary for Elementary and Secondary Education, although I heard he may be leaving, so there you go. I don't know how long that's going to last. But of course, it's more than one person, and I just wanted to make that point, though, that while what we've tried to do is be very assertive in our positions, be very clear in our positions, but quite frankly, not be personal either. We're not in the business of attacking anybody personally, but being very clear about where we draw the line on various policy issues, and I think we've done that pretty clearly. I mean, when the president announced the change in the DACA rules, we issued a statement pretty quickly to make sure that people knew where we stood. So those are important questions for us. And then finally, I would just say, generally speaking, questions of funding and federal support for education. So we continue to be pretty vigilant around that. It's going to be a challenge. You know that the president put on the table a budget that was frankly pretty much dead on arrival in Congress, given the extent of the cuts that he was proposing. But it also means that we have to fight to maintain critical funding, particularly in areas around Title I and some other places that really make a big difference to a lot of school districts around the country. I mean, people sometimes, I think, get a little bit misled by saying, well, federal funding as a percentage of total dollars is relatively small. Well, generally speaking, that's true, but it can be and is very impactful, certainly for some districts and for certain programs. So we're really careful about that. And beyond all the policy issues, a lot of our work deals with trying to support and work with state associations to make sure that you have the information and the assistance that you need. So I really would be interested in hearing from you, first of all, how you think that's going and what we might be doing that we're not working on. But instead of rambling more and more, let me just stop and see if you have any questions.
I just want to make a comment about the federal funding piece, because it's a huge issue for us here in Vermont. We've done pretty well getting federal funding here in the state, and I can't remember the exact number, maybe one of you remember it better, but I think it was 32 or something % of our budget out of the Agency of Education is federal fund. That is that could be a huge impact on us
Yeah.
here. So the work that you do for our state organizations is critically important. That voice has to continue to be expressed over and over again about how important those federal dollars are for us. This is scary, honestly, right
I
now.
agree. You know, those dollars, of course, there's always a challenge in terms of the prioritization.
Yeah.
One of the things that we're really going to try to do more of, we've done a lot already, is to try to translate that because, I think it was Everett Dirksen who made that comment many, many years ago about $1 billion here and $1 billion there. At some point when you're dealing in Congress, it's just a lot of money, right, for a lot of programs, whatever it is. Our job, I think, is to kind of create a line of sight between those dollars that are being appropriated and what they actually mean in the classroom. What do they mean for a school district? By the way, Emily, one of the other things that was, I think, this sort of blinding glimpse of the obvious for me at some point. Your agency for education, other state education departments, probably, and we need to actually kind of get the exact number, but in many cases, the majority of the staff in those state agencies are funded with federal dollars. Most people don't really know that. I mean, state governments have cut back, which creates a lot of other dynamics. That's also a challenge for us because if whichever administration's in office, so this is not, I can make some partisan comments, this one is not partisan. Whichever administration's in power though, when you think about the federalism, I'm using that term in the classic sense, right? The relationship between the federal, state, and local levels of government. Well, it assumes that there's sort of this vigorous kind of debate and conversation going on between the federal and state levels. If the state government is dependent on federal dollars to even run the agency, that skews that relationship. I mean, it's a really interesting challenge for us, I think.
It's important.
Can I just throw out a big compliment to you? Because I want you to know, I've read this, and I am extremely impressed with this. And I'm not just trying to be gratuitous here. This is, I think this is exactly the kind of work that school boards associations need to be engaged in terms of leading the conversation about what public education should be. You know this as well as I do, and certainly over my years of working in school boards. One of the knocks that I don't like ever, but I think we hear it a lot, which is you guys are defending the status quo, school boards are resistant to change. Well, this event that we had on the Hill yesterday and some of the other information we put out, I think clearly demonstrates that that's not true. But what we're not doing enough of, I think, is this kind of work, is actually leading the discussion at the state level and sort of challenging the state leaders to say, here's the system of education that we've envisioned, and you've worked with others to do it, which I commend you for. And then laying out, I was particularly impressed with not just what the vision was, but the, sort of the so what. In order to do this, to recognize and to accomplish these things, these are the steps that need to be taken. So I just want you to know, I thank you for doing that. We're going to, with your permission, share that with others, because I think it really needs to be seen. And I know some other state associations have gone through some visioning processes and so on. I think we just need to encourage that to happen. But well done.
Would you mind just sharing a bit about the NSBA's role in the healthcare debate? Because I think that was a huge victory that, or huge accomplishment in terms of educating members of Congress on the intersection between healthcare and education. Well,
thank you. To me, this was an example, perhaps, for all of us of not assuming anything, right? And this is going to sound like a cheap shot against Congress, and it really isn't. Because I think there are a lot of members of Congress, including many who are very friendly to us, who really didn't get the connection between Medicaid dollars and public schools. I mean, we had numerous meetings on the Hill, our staff and others, talking about this, and it was like just light bulbs going off. And it really gave, for the ones who were particularly opposed to the proposals to modify or change Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, it really gave them some very valuable information. I mean, we had a meeting that we were invited to, I went to with Senator Schumer and Wyden and Murray. And in fact, we were the only K-12 education group there, but they specifically thanked us for the work to kind of help share that information. And of course, it wasn't just saying, these go to schools, but we had letters and all kinds of communications from our members throughout the country saying, well, here are examples of programs that are dependent on those funds. And literally, I don't think many members of Congress actually knew that. So it was a good opportunity for us to inform. And to, again, partner with the state associations to share good examples of why that was important. We're not done yet, by the way. There are continuing rumors and rumors of rumors or something like that, that they have not given up on that yet, that the administration may come back with some other effort. So we just caution everybody to remain vigilant on that whole issue.
Anybody else have anything to share? I can't believe this is a quiet group tonight.
Yeah.
A question, actually. If you look at school boards across the country or school board associations across the country, do you get the feeling that we are all collectively heading in the same direction, or is there disparity in how certain parts of the country see things? Are we working well as a group, or not so much?
That's a really fair question. I think, yes, we're working well. I mean, I think as a federation, I think there's a pretty high level of cohesion in terms of, I think, purpose and mission and so on. There's a pretty wide variance in terms of how the different associations sort of attack their work. I mean, you have a relatively small staff. Others have a very large staff and they're very entrepreneurial, and they tend to be really, in some ways, and I don't mean this negatively, but they tend to be really focused on a lot of the entrepreneurial activities. I mean, that tends to drive a lot of their work. But I think in terms of the role of school boards, I think there's generally a recognition that we all need to be about leading that discussion. Some are doing a better job of it than others. And again, it's not a cheap thank you, but you guys are among those, I think, that really have done some really important work in that area. And there are a few others that are really trying to get school board members to have that conversation. And by the way, at our NSBA board meeting in December, we're setting aside probably about half a day for our own board to have this discussion, sort of that, we know public education is changing, needs to change. What is the role of boards in both leading that change and in helping to be effective governors of the change? And I think it's important for us as a leadership team in our organization to have the conversation too. So I think some are thinking about that more than others, but I think, as Nicole would, I think, agree with me, the state executive directors meetings are really one of those places where a lot of that information gets exchanged. And of course, at our summer leadership conference as well. Because one of the things that I see us as being uniquely positioned to do is to be a broker of that kind of information, to make sure people are aware of what's happening in other associations and getting people thinking about it. So, I mean, I'm not naive to think that all the organizations, all the state associations are going to keep moving at the same pace in the same way. But, I always said when I was a state executive that I was and I still am actually, a kleptomaniac for good ideas. I mean, if I see something that's really interesting, you don't have to replicate that exactly, but that may lead you in your state, given your dynamics, to do something that you might not have thought about otherwise. And that's why we try to use our conferences and meetings as an opportunity to try to share that in our publication. Does that answer the question?
I think so.
After appointing a lightning rod as Secretary of Education, things have seemed to be relatively quiet in that front in total. Is that because you think our federal government is just bogged down with other things, or are we just going to get broadsided sometime in the near future with a Republican process that
Yeah.
we're not going to enjoy?
You know, I'm reminded that things are quiet in the eye of a hurricane too, so I guess we have to keep that in mind. Well, I'll be very candid here. I think part of what's happened right now is, for reasons I think are obvious, the Trump administration has kind of tripped over itself on a number of occasions in terms of messaging and so on. And I just don't think education has been one of those things that they've moved out in front. But there's another piece to this that I found really interesting, because I've been to several meetings and I have talked to folks like at the Fordham Foundation and others who might not agree with us in a lot of things, but we at least have a good working relationship. And what I found interesting is a lot of folks sort of, I just say on the right, are not in agreement among themselves about what should happen. It's very interesting. One event I went to was a discussion about school choice. Right? There were those on the panel. These were all, I would say, conservative groups. Some of them were arguing for a federal voucher system, and their argument essentially was, look, Republicans have the House, they have the Senate, they have the presidency. Now's the time to make this happen. There were others who were saying, well, no, I don't think so. We ought to go more for a tax credit. So even those who wanted something to happen were not agreeing. And then there was the Cato Institute. If you're familiar with Cato, it's a very libertarian group. They actually had a really good argument, which was, look, we want choice, but anything the federal government touches gets screwed up, and we really don't want the federal government involved in this at all. And so I think part of this right now, I'm not saying it's the whole dynamic, but I think part of it is they're just not in agreement about what can be done. Now, having said that, I think the concern is, and the more likely path right now is, if they do tax reform, that some kind of education tax credit provision could be put into a tax bill, and it wouldn't run through the education committees. It wouldn't go through that normal process, and it probably would be easier to get passed on a fairly short notice. Now, even there, it's not clear what that would look like, because there are different versions of that floating around. And I don't think the administration's actually presented a proposal yet about what they want. And that's been the other issue, right? I mean, normally Congress at least wants to see what the president's looking for. In this case, I don't know that we even know that. So I would say there's a good chance something will happen. We don't know what it is, but I don't think there's a real strong support among, I'll just say the right generally, about what should happen right now. And understandably, I mean, actually, I think the point the Cato Institute made was, from their point of view, I mean, I talked to one of their guys about this. Their notion was, all right, even if this administration did exactly what we want, some future administration, probably of a different party at some point, is going to do something to that plan that we're not going to like, right? And that's their concern, is how do you protect against that? And the answer is you can't, right? Once it's passed, it can always be changed or modified in some way. So I just don't, I think it's just not clear what it's going to happen. I would say, though, I think there's going to be an effort to do something. And my concern, if I had to make a bet, would be it'd be something like a tax credit that they could pass relatively easily.
That's the school choice tax
Yeah.
credit type.
Right, and that could happen a couple of different ways. It could be for individuals, or it could be more sort of, what we see in a lot of states where corporations and others can donate money for a scholarship program and get a tax credit for that. So it's sort of an indirect tax credit, or an indirect voucher.
So when you're talking about choice, I have two questions. One, I assume you're talking about the choice to go to an independent or a private school, then, if you're talking about a voucher, as opposed to just choice among public schools and charter schools. Is that right?
Generally.
Generally, okay.
Yeah.
And second, is there any discussion about, maybe opening up that choice on the state level so that the states have more control over it instead of the federal government?
Well, see, I'm glad you said that, because that's sort of the corollary to what I was just saying. I should have commented, because there are a lot of people who are very strong proponents who really don't think the federal government should be involved. This should be a state-by-state effort, because state laws vary so much. And so I think that's a very real dynamic. There's a real concern about how the federal government might affect that. And in fact, some of the, I think most respected proponents of vouchers and tax credits and so on would probably say they think the real laboratories of reform and innovation in that whole area have been at the state level. I mean, there are very different laws around that. So I think that's part of this dynamic that's affecting what the federal government might do. Just a quick comment though about charter schools, because I think our position is we support charters if the school board authorizes them, so that there's some accountability through local elected officials. And that's been NSBA's position for years, and I think it's the position of most of the state associations. A number of the state associations, including in Pennsylvania when I was exec, we provided services to charter schools. If the local school district didn't object, and frankly, whether the district granted the charter or not, the district never objected to us providing training. So I think there's also part within the federation of our state associations of kind of finding the right relationship. In Idaho, charter schools are full voting members of the Idaho School Boards Association. In other states, they have some kind of associate membership. They don't have voting rights, but they have entitlements to services, that kind of thing. And in other cases, like when I was in Pennsylvania, I don't know what they're doing now, it was more ad hoc, and we kind of just met the need as it came up. I think the challenge for us in charter schools has always been in places where there are multiple authorizers, and there's really less accountability. And so the general rule that we've kind of laid out, and we said it again yesterday at this program at the Capitol, which is there should be uniform accountability for any tax dollars that go to any school, any public tax dollars that go to any school. And it's not just, it's the level playing field argument, because that's part of it. That's a big part of it. But the other is, as I've often said to people, if you're talking about money following the child, and I understand that argument, but the reality is the money that's following the child is not the child's parents' money, right? It's the public's money, and that's the accountability that school boards as elected officials can provide. So it's not that we're opposed to choice. It's about that, and I'll just share this with you quickly. Years ago, I was at a meeting. Actually, it was when I was still state exec, and we had a pollster in D.C. I think he did a lot of polling for more Democratic clients than Republicans. So I just put that on the table. But he was talking to the state execs, and he said, "So, when you hear the word accountability, what does that mean to you?" And we all took the bait. We all said, "Well, student achievement, student performance." And he said, when we use the word accountability and we test it with the public, they think tax dollars. How are my tax dollars being spent? So it's very interesting just from a messaging point of view when we're talking to the public and we use terms that we understand to mean one thing and they're interpreting something differently. So that was my one big takeaway. But the other takeaway is, well, the public really cares about how tax dollars are being spent. And so it's not that those choice options are always bad or something. It's just that they are public funds, and somebody needs to be held accountable for how they're being spent. And I think that's a very strong argument that we can make, because it's not an anti-choice argument by any means, because I think, as I've traveled around the country, there are a lot of school districts that are very supportive of all kinds of innovative choice options. As we said yesterday, obviously within the public school system, but even some outside. So it wasn't that. It was more who's going to be held accountable for how the tax dollars are being spent. And I think that's really a strong argument for us to keep it. at the federal and at the state level.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Want to put a bug in his ear about something? This is your chance. Go ahead, Kim.
And I was just going to follow up with that notion of accountability for tax dollars. Did anything come out of that survey that lent to the idea that it wasn't just for some kids, but that accountability is tax dollars for the education and public good of all kids? So I'm just wanting to have a sense that that's clear for people.
Well, yes, I mean, we've been talking about this, and frankly, and I'll just share this, because this is something I'm feeling really strongly about, and it's bothering me actually quite a bit. Because what I sense is happening in the larger school choice debate, frankly, is we're all, we see people kind of all retreating to their own tribes almost, right? And we're seeing a lot, I mean, frankly, there's a lot of evidence now that we're seeing a resegregation of schools. And not always driven by choice options, but that's certainly, I think, a driver. And what's being lost, I think, sometimes is this notion of public education as a public good. I mean, this whole business of immigration and so forth, that's what built this country. I'm sorry, I'm on my soapbox now. And, and that's what assimilated so many different people, into this country. And I really think we risk losing that. I mean, that's probably my bigger concern than a specific, voucher or tax credit bill. I mean, those are important and we have to debate them. But it's the role that public education plays as a societal good. And so when we launched this stand-up campaign, we had a couple of goals. Actually three, I guess. One was to make sure that people even understood what school boards are, because with all due respect, not everybody knows. Right? Secondly, that we're sort of telling that good news about what's happening in a lot of schools, and we're trying to use the voice of students and teachers and the people who are actually in the schools. And I think you saw the video, some of you, that we produced. So we're trying to get a lot of these stories. But then the third one is this larger question. I mean, why public education is important in this country, and what's unique about it, really, to our country. So I think that has to drive all the work that we're doing, and that's why, I mean, whether it's equity or any of these topics, that's at the root of it, really. And sometimes, I tell people, public education is a birthright, but it's not guaranteed, because it can be whittled away little by little, and suddenly, okay, one more story, I promise this will be. So I'm from Pennsylvania, right, and Gensel, so there's a lot of Pennsylvania German community. Well, if you know anything about the history of the state, and this is true in a lot of states, so I'm just giving this as one example. So the Pennsylvania Germans had their own schools, and they taught their kids in German. And the Scotch Irish and the other, I mean, they all had their own schools. So that's why when, in our case, in Pennsylvania, it was Thaddeus Stevens, before he went on to Congress, was a state legislator, and he got the public education law passed. And it was extremely controversial. I read a number of articles about this. I mean, wait a minute, first of all, you're gonna tax me to pay for those kids' education, right? But it was a very Jeffersonian notion, right? You can't have a democracy unless people are well educated and everybody can participate. But so now we're gonna spend tax dollars to educate everybody, and God forbid, it was gonna be in English, right? So the Germans were, so I tell people, I apologize for anything my ancestors might have done back in the 1830s. But I have a funny feeling there were some Gensels that were opposed to it. So part of my mission is to
Right their wrongs.
But that's the history of this country. Was that's why public education was, I think, seen, and why we have to keep talking about it, because a lot of people don't even think about that. It's just something that's there, and you drive by the public schools. So I'll climb off my soapbox. That's what drives me.
Thanks, Tom. So I think you're going to stick around?
Yeah. that's
So
right.
if somebody has a burning question for him, he's got an open seat next to him at lunch. You can saddle right up and go to it. All right, so quarterly financial report and financial policy update.
gonna turn it over to Kim.
So we are at year-end, folks, in our weird fiscal year. And we are ending with a surplus. The notes, I think, cover any discrepancies off of what we anticipated with respect to budget. So I don't think I have anything to add there unless people have questions. I'm not hearing any. We're certainly with a healthy cash balance, and we, do we want to handle these separately, the financial policy and the?
Well, they don't, the practice is not to accept the financial report, so I think we could just sort of move on in if anyone has questions.
I do have one question, I think it's apropos since we have the executive director here, but how, do we get a dues notice after we build our budget? Because if you see, I think we budgeted for dues and they came in $2,800 over. Am I reading this right?
Yes.
Is that because of the sequence of we build our budget and then they build theirs and us dues?
That was because, yes, when I got the dues invoice from the NSBA, I made a call to Heather. What's happening? And so what the NSBA dues key off of our revenue, and they have a rank, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, they sort of rank the states in order of revenue. And because we have a couple of pass-through grants and also new revenue coming in from VSBA that we're using for contracted services, we jumped a slot or two.
So we should have given
Which
that money
we
back.
hadn't anticipated as we were building the budget. So we now know that and are paying attention to it. In fact, we're in the process of finalizing a grant application today, and we're building in money in there for overhead to cover any additional costs to the association that
But
not
even
just
pass-through
NSBA
monies
dues.
that we just handle, like the conference, something that would count against us?
I don't think it, I think if it's a direct
If
pass-through,
it's a direct pass-through, it would not. Right?
Okay.
If you're just
a
literally
fiscal
handling the
aging
money.
it,
Yeah,
yeah.
for convenience, if we handle the money and gain nothing from it.
But the, correct me if I'm wrong, Carrie, I think the Act 46 implementation project and the collective bargaining and the legal services grants that we've received from VSBA they're not technically passed through because we do have contractors, independent contractors that we use
The
in that
number
arrangement.
the number the NSBA uses is directly from our taxes, which is from our audit, so it comes from,
Yeah, the 994.
yes.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering, the board development and consulting are down significantly from what we expected. Do we know why, or?
My sense is that most of board's time recent in the last 2 years has been devoted to Act 46. So we've done a lot of consulting services through that,
Yes.
through the project. That's the explanation that I can come up with. And I think more board members are participating in activities like the regional bargaining councils. So one of the pieces of work we're doing with Susan is identifying how we're gonna sort of ramp up that and continue to do outreach and marketing of the service now that things are maybe starting to calm down and boards are gonna be more focused on their own development, rather than creating a new school district or negotiating a contract.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on it. I think that's a great question, and it's time. It is literally time for us to get back to the core of what we actually do. And we have been so consumed, me included, at our local level, talking about governance. But as we walk forward through all this process that we're going through, this is when we really need to be thinking about who we are and what we're here for. And so board development is critically important right now. Are we having, I haven't been to a regional meeting yet, are we having that conversation at all at the regional meetings, talking about finding a path forward to encouraging boards all over the state to get familiar with our services that we provide and expressing the need to take advantage of those services? Or are we just so consumed in our regional meetings, we don't have time for that?
So a couple of things, we expanded the time of the business meeting to talk about the bylaws change and the dues change, and in that segment, talk about all the services available through the VSBA to members. We always have our brochures and flyers at the meeting, but the bulk of the program is really focused on the resolutions and the FY19 fiscal picture. Because that,
Be a good idea to
our
try to
problem is we
find
find
out.
ourselves chasing one crisis after
I know.
another.
Well, the other night in Winooski, when you broke us into or divided us into bunch of groups, and I guess Emily was in ours. But I took away that some of the people there really wanted more interaction with VSBA at the regional level and the services we get. So in a way, I think that there are people out there, I probably wouldn't say we want to go back to the way it was, but they would say, you know, hey, VSBA, a regional meeting that focuses on a set agenda may not be meeting our needs and the timing of the resolution. Is that true?
I heard them saying that they wanted to talk regionally to each other about resolutions specifically.
I heard that, but I also heard them say, you people there, and you said you can't expect Nicole and I to be at all
In
these meetings.
February.
And somebody said, well, if you're not here, we'll still probably talk, you can give you things to do. But anyway, but the concept was there, right? That they really wanted that. So
And I think that's consistent with the board's discussion in June at your
Yeah.
retreat, that once the new board is formed in November, there's gonna be a real conversation around how to support you as regional reps in doing outreach within your regions, and what that, what that could look like, and what support you need from staff in order to pull that off. So, I think that is a good opportunity to, again, remind people of what we do and what resources we have available.
I agree with Emily. I think that's, that's our core reason for existence. When this other stuff settles down, we'll be here for that. I'm sure there'll always be issues. And are we introducing Susan and giving her a chance to at the regional meetings, or so people get to know her?
Susan
Great.
is parked at the door greeting people and
Nobody's gonna
chatting
get
with them,
hired.
and then she's also facilitating, we have a small group discussion, and
Right.
so she takes a group, and so, I'll let you speak for yourself, but I think it's been a good, at least 2 meetings in,
I think so.
opportunity to meet people.
you can't get your buffet ticket if you don't go for Susan.
That's right.
All right, so,
I'm the meal ticket.
so I'll entertain a motion to accept the treasurer's report.
Oh, second?
So we have first by Clarence and second by Amy McMullen. Any further discussion?
The only thing I'll say is I'm not sure that we usually take a formal motion on it. It's completely fine that we do, and we always take questions, but
But what we
Is
do
it better
need
to have
is
it than not
action on
have
the
it?
financial
We
policies.
do.
That's what we need.
Yeah, we
So
will on
just-
the
I'm
next
fine with just a nod of the heads then. But I would change one thing in here. I would change the word net profit and just say surplus, because we're not in the business of trying to make money.
We don't want to be known as a profit.
My business tries to make money, we try to make a profit, but here I think we're just having a surplus.
Under the annual
Yeah.
conference line item?
It's
Yeah,
under
it says
several,
profit,
it's
says
under
it's
several
profit.
line items, and some of them it doesn't say it. One of
Yeah.
them says net income, that's fine. But
Yeah.
I just think that the word profit is a touchy word. All right, so,
Financial policy.
financial policies.
So as Nicole and I were talking, I think we brought up at the meeting last month, we recognized that we don't have a policy that speaks to our net asset reserve fund, or guidelines that sort of direct us where that may be. In the past, it had been quite high, and it intentionally was spent down with deficit spending a couple years in a row. And make sure I'm getting this right, Nicole.
Mhm.
And yet there was nothing from a policy level that is guiding sort of the range that we're targeting. As we talked a little bit more about it, tried to find sort of examples of good practice out there around this. We learned from some language that the BSA uses. We spoke with our accountant and came to a place of sort of altering creating a statement, but then also including what is definitely a little more procedural around how we approve expenditures. So if you roll down or flip over, the changes are noted in track changes. A broad statement, and then specifics. If there'll be a general warrant at the beginning of the year that identifies anticipated expenses, and the warrants and categories that'll be paid over the course of the year. If there are anything outside of that that exceeds $1,000, Nicole and Carrie will send an email to me, and we'll have a conversation, and I'll send an email back saying go for it. We talked a little bit to make sure that that doesn't create a time crunch for them or a concern, and where those things might happen, perhaps like an attorney's fee that came in at a different time than anticipated or greater than anticipated, but offset by something else. So we talked a little bit about practice and if this is going to be okay with them, and that seems to work. As we scroll down to address the net asset reserve fund, we had some guidance from our accountant that said 250,000, and we talked a little bit more about that as what does that actually represent for us and why that number. And it is sort of in keeping with around where we are right now, but I asked if we could look at, if we were not passing through funds from VSBA or otherwise and contracting services, what is our monthly cost to run this business without losing employees and keeping, the lights on here? And so that would represent approximately 5 months, I'm thinking, we're calling Nicole, worth of expenses that are not things that are contracted otherwise and services outside of that which we do in-house. So what we put in the policy is some language that speaks to that. So I would, rather than taking a somewhat arbitrary number of 250,000, I would maybe recommend that we do a range of sort of months of coverage so that it's dynamic and follows the expenses of our organization. And we left an X there to be filled in by a conversation that we have together. I think as we spoke, we felt it reasonable to consider 4 to 6 months of operating expenses, and we define here what we consider to be normal operating expenses. What did I miss?
No, that is very comprehensive. I think a couple of things, just, this came up in the budget discussion when we were talking about using our net assets and having the realization that we have no policy on guiding the board as it's developing its budget. If you want to tap into reserves or your net assets in order to smooth out dues increases, which is fine, but you've given no guidance to the executive committee or me what's an appropriate amount to make sure we're maintaining. And as Kim said, we went through a period where this board allowed that reserve to go, fairly low, and we need to just make sure we're clear on what's happening every year and how it relates to the overall financial status of the organization. So it's really important that we have this in place for next year. And also, as Kim said, we recognize that there's really not a lot of checks on Carrie and I issuing checks at this point. And that it would be, I think it's important that the treasurer have a more formal role in authorizing expenditures. And what works in the VSA, which I think will work for us being a small operation, is to have a master warrant where we say, we know these are our regular monthly expenses, the treasurer approves that, anything outside that, beyond $1,000 needs to be checked in with the treasurer. That feels better to me, that there's another check within the system. It's not something that was raised by the auditor, it's something we
And it wasn't something that I was especially worried about until we got to considering how we were going to do the budget, particularly around using reserve or not using reserve, and found that there was really nothing to guide that. So it is good practice to set some parameters around that use that feels comfortable for the folks here. And we realized we really needed to see that in writing. I think any of the other changes were related to.
Can we go back to, you want to do them all?
Sure, I'll just, the other is minimal, it was cleanup language because I see the financial reports monthly. We share them in a board package quarterly. So that was a clarification that got cleaned up in this round as well. I think that's it. Yes, Don?
So you mentioned 4 to 6 months. Are you coming up with a recommendation? Because I've been on a few boards over the years, and if I remember right, usually it was 6 months.
So,
But I don't know what you and Nicole are recommending.
If you set it at 6 months, we'll be immediately in violation of our policy.
and
So maybe that should be our goal to move it.
well, so again, our auditor and accountant's
Auditor.
Auditor's
Carrie's our
recommendation.
accountant.
Oh, sorry. Carrie does it all. She has a lot of hats. So our auditor's recommendation was 250,000, and that seemed like I was like, so did she say why, and what was she talking about with it?
That's more than 4 or 6
What did it
months,
mean?
right?
So it's actually 5 months,
5?
and that's what I wanted to know. Like, it's not our, operating budget is what would happen. We could stop our other services. If VSBA yanked their money or something dramatic happened, we would stop contracting out those services. We would not want to have to start slashing and burning our staff of 4. While we would figure out strategically what we would do about changes that impact our services. And so I didn't feel comfortable with just picking 250,000. We didn't have a whole lot more from the auditor, I don't think, about why that number seemed reasonable. So I said, what does that actually represent in terms of what our regular operating expenses would be? That represented right now 5 months. The notion of doing 4 to 6 months gives us some flexibility if we notice real challenges for membership, or there are times where I think we've intentionally spent our balances to help mitigate dues, knowing, I think at Challenges for Change time we did that, where we either held it at 0 or may have even, we are smoothing out increases with our dues structure change over 3 years, and that's taking on some expense on ourselves to do that. So my recommendation is that we go with a range of 4 to 6 months. So it would say the association will maintain a net asset reserve fund equivalent to 4 to 6 months normal operating expenses to be allocated for future association expenses. And then the normal operating costs is defined.
Is that allowable according to accounting, to have a flexible number? We have to have a defined, definite number.
I would think so. We had nothing.
We have
so
nothing.
this- So this is a huge improvement. I think our auditor didn't say we needed to have had anything when asked for a recommendation. She provided a 250.
And she said it's whatever the board feels comfortable with.
Yeah. And I think, again, to provide the range of months keeps us in compliance right now and allows for us to go higher when we feel we are in a position to be able to do so, and keeps us from going too low. Because imagining if something dramatic were to happen, within 4 months, I would hope we'd come up with a strategic plan to react to that dramatic change, to maintain services, or to change, in fact, the way we operate. So I think that felt comfortable as we spoke about it, and way better to me than a stagnant number, which if we don't change is going to be reducing itself from 5 months to 4 months pretty quickly as we go year over year. So I feel like it keeps us more honest to why we have the reserve in the first place.
So 4 would be the trigger that we have a problem.
Right, that we would not allow ourselves
We've
to
got other
do that.
voices that want to be
Thank
heard.
you.
Clarence, then Mary
Thanks.
Kate, and Stuart.
The question I have is 4 to 6 months is fine. Well, I'd like to know, we approve a budget, we send out the bills to the school districts. What's the lag time before the majority of the money starts rolling in? What's that gap of time that we would probably need to be covering to be able to operate out of this fund before that happens. I don't know what the normal lag is around here, but there's gotta be one.
30 to 45 days. It
Okay.
takes to process the checks.
So
to
it's
school districts.
1 to 2 months, so the 4 to 6, you're fine, covers the worst case
Cash in.
scenario of that. That was my question.
Good question, thanks.
And our bylaws say that invoices are due within 60 days, I think.
Yeah, it does.
Whether they pay them out to.
Right, but generally speaking, they're a compliant bunch.
And I contact them if they have.
I know some business managers, pretty independent with a checkbook.
Just had a couple questions. So
We
if
put
we're-
in policy.
I think having the 46-month and having that flexibility is important. There are a lot of different things happening with the due structures. My concern is that we could be out of compliance even with the 4 to 6 months. If we're out of compliance, do we have a policy that says what the procedures for that? Or do we want to add to the policy something in the beginning saying absent board approval, the association will? And then my second question was, do we have a policy on the use of the reserve funds?
So, to me, this is really a guidepost for the board as they're developing their budget. And so when August comes around, which is the month you approve the budget, we have a pretty good idea of how we're gonna end the fiscal year. And so we were projecting a $20,000 surplus, when you looked at the budget, and which is what informed the discussion around use of a portion of, that surplus and prior year surplus to keep dues, low. We're, unaudited end of year financials indicate a, larger surplus than we thought, although there's still some moving pieces. So I think what this is really intended to do is, 4 months is $189,000 roughly. So we're well within that range with our current cash balance. And I think unless we see some sizable shift in dues paying members as a result of this transition, and again, to Kim's point, that then creates the conversation around what's the board. So it's less about whether or not we're in compliance and more about what's the board's response going to be if it appears as though the budget that you passed in August is not likely to be in any way accurate because you're not getting the dues revenue you anticipated.
But the board, with this policy, if we're not within the 4 to 6 months, that information comes to the board.
Absolutely.
My second question was use of the reserve fund. Do we have a policy on that?
Well, the auditor recommended that we keep it fairly broad, and that it be, that phrase allocated for future association expenses. So, the general
To be allocated, okay.
financial policy would require me to be operating within the budget that you passed and not sort of arbitrarily dipping in anything that is substantially outside the budget. Number one, now we have the treasurer's check, but I would expect to need to come before the board and say, we're gonna need to use more of our net reserves, and then the board needs to have a discussion about that, about whether it's
And I
an
think-
appropriate use of those.
I would agree, and I think, just thinking about practice again, this will be a new practice, but that quarterly, as we share the financial reports where we have things outside of the anticipated master warrant, that may be a time that is in the notes, because it's going to go against a particular line item, and it will
Yeah.
be something that we will have had sort of eyes on to remember at quarterly time when they put in the notes what's variant from the expected. That will be something that I would anticipate wanting to share quarterly.
From my experience when I was treasurer, one of the biggest problems that we have is we work with a little bit of smoke and mirrors, that historically, by definition, we've had to have 0 net income every year. And, which is, hopefully, this is changing that, but I think we have to be very clear on that. That if we have a larger than 4 to 6 month surplus at the end of a year, then that additional funds should be used as revenue to reduce that. So you would not have 0 net income that year. You would have basically a loss coming through. And the same thing that if for some reason for 2 or 3 years we have higher expenditures than revenue, then we would have to actually put that into the budget, where we would be either have income would be higher than expenses for a certain amount of money in order to replenish our reserves. So we need to get rid of that idea that every year our budget has to have a 0 net income, because it's going to fluctuate now based on what our reserves are.
Right.
And it's a moving target, but I think we have to look at it when we do our budget, because so many of our items are seasonal that we can't look at it at a 3-month period and overreact to say, well, wait a minute, we're not going to meet our criteria, our ratio. We have to look at it, and this could switch over 2 or 3 years. It doesn't say that we have to meet it. This has to be our goal. So as part of our budget process, we need to be looking at that both for the future and then how we're going to rectify it.
That makes perfect sense, and I think we may still be targeting sort of 0 budgeting, but it may be that the dues is adjusted for the revenue brought to the formula from an overage of greater than 6 months, but I agree that that makes sense as we think about it when we go into budgeting.
We have a $36,000 net income or surplus this year, and we budgeted 0. What happens is we've always sort of fudged a couple of numbers in order to come out to 0.
When we're budgeting. Yeah.
When we're budgeting,
Yeah.
where we really shouldn't be.
Right.
So, yep, so Mary Kate's moving this. I'm assuming you're gonna move this with a 4 to 6 month thing, because that was X'd out?
Yeah, so I move to adopt the financial policy revisions with 4 to 6 months.
Okay, do we have a second on that?
Second.
So we have a first and a second, Ken?
Yeah, I have a question totally unrelated to the reserve fund. On the first page, just a few lines up from mileage reimbursement, it speaks to who can sign the checks. And it says executive director, and then associate is crossed out, so it says director. Is that some sort of typo?
No, so we don't have associate directors anymore. So we
Yeah.
have director of legal and policy services, director of board services. So associate director doesn't exist as a title within the
Yeah,
organization
so
right now.
I think we need another word or 2 in there. It says executive director, director, and any board member, so that second director is kind of,
Well, right,
They're all called they, but you guys are all called.
they're all directors.
We're all directors, so Nicole would make the decision.
And the-
So in the
So-
past, Harry had the authorization to sign checks, and I had the authorization.
so that is correct. You're just calling legal director and
Yeah.
and education
Director of
director.
legal policy, director of board education, director of
Thank you.
operations. Yep.
Any
We're a lot of
other
directors on stage.
I directed myself
comments?
very well.
Seeing none, all those in favor of accepting the policy, the rewrite on the policies, please say aye.
Aye.
Any noes? Any abstentions? All right, I think, Carrie, food's ready?
Yes.
All right, let's eat.
We will be distributing electronically in the not-too-distant future. Really intended to anticipate questions that are out there around both the annual meeting voting process and the new dues structure. Dues invoices went out last week, so folks may start to talk about it or ask questions. These are for your reference, so that if people ask you questions, you have answers to them. But I hope that they're comprehensive enough that they really address some of the questions that folks out there might have. So I wanted you to be aware that those resources have been developed. In terms of the annual meeting voting process, we are strongly encouraging supervisory union boards to appoint a delegate, but we're not requiring it this year. That's something that you all need to, I think about for next year as you consider whether you want to implement any procedures around the annual meeting. I know I was looking at VLCT's materials, for example. They do require folks to submit information about the delegate ahead of time or sign in at their conference, as I am the delegate. So we might want to just see how it goes this year and then have a conversation around need to provide information ahead of time. But, I was hoping that the board would really spend some time tonight talking about a proposal that we received. And I want to back up a little bit by saying it is not a new frustration, I think, for some of our members who think that our annual meeting is held at an inconvenient time and place, and that participation in the resolutions process is not as robust as it could be because of the inconvenience of how the meeting is and where the meeting is held. Which is one reason why you all, as part of the bylaws changes that you're putting to the membership, are adjusting the bylaws to allow for the board to adopt policies and procedures that would authorize remote participation. So right now, the bylaws do not allow for remote participation. You're recommending to the members that they authorize you to develop procedures to do that. You're not required to do it, but it would give the board some flexibility to address that concern. Particularly, I think, given the fact that now we have fewer eligible members, eligible voting members, it's really important to create as many avenues to participate in the process as possible. It's one thing when you have 15% of your eligible members voting and you have 277 members. And it's another if you've got 15% of eligible members and that's 5 people sitting in a room. So I don't think that that's going to happen, but I think the more robust participation, the better this organization is able to respond to concerns that, well, you don't represent school boards anymore because you only have 60 members. So we were having that conversation as a staff, thinking about some suggested bylaws language, and we were approached by Lachlan Francis, who many of you might know. He was a student member on the State Board of Education a few years ago, was a big attender of our functions and came to a lot of conferences. Anyway, Lachlan's a student at UVM, and his summer job this year was working for, so you all have in your packets, or not in your packet, working for this company called Votes, which specializes in secure voting through electronic means. And so Lachlan asked if we would meet with the owner of this startup, essentially. And I agreed to do that. In the course of the conversation, it became apparent to me that this type of a platform, whether or not it's this platform in particular, might be a solution to some of the questions that this board will inevitably have around how do you facilitate remote participation in meetings. Because it's important that while there are web-based programs to do that, oftentimes you can't guarantee that that link hasn't been shared, that just anybody can log in, access the app, and participate in a vote. So you really need some type of secure platform that's going to ensure that the person who's voting is the delegate that's been authorized to cast the vote. And that's what these guys do. They ran the voting process for the Massachusetts Democratic Convention and have been recognized by Harvard and MIT as being a sort of really a good platform for secure voting. They do have an interest in working in Vermont. They have an interest in testing secure voting technology in a number of different types of venues, including elections. They met with Jim Condos, and Jim Condos told them, we're not doing elections in Vermont with this type of platform unless it's been embraced and tested at the local level, which is why I think they wanted to meet with us. So I think it was a convergence of interests of, well, hey, we have this need, and they have an interest in building some relationships at the ground level in Vermont to see whether what they offer in terms of their software has any appeal here. So I convinced them to sponsor the conference, so they are a sponsor.
Good job.
They will be, so they'll have their platform and some, tablets and stuff there to show school board members the types of things they can use it for. So opinion polling, and there's other interactive options that might be interesting to school board members. And I also raised the prospect of, if this board thought it was a good idea, testing that voting software at our annual meeting. And made very clear that it was your decision, but that I would bring it to you guys with this information about who they are and what they do. So the concept would be, so who here hasn't been to one of our annual meetings? Anyone?
You're off the hook,
You're all
Susan.
familiar with the process, which can be at times clunky. So we have looked into clickers or other ways of streamlining the voting process, which can sometimes, it's been so I think a couple years ago we started using rulers, yes, plastic rulers. And it is time consuming and awkward. And ends up, consuming time, which I think people would rather be talking about the resolutions on, do we have the right number of votes? Furthermore, if you're going to be opening up a process for remote participation, you have to have some platform to allow that to happen. So my suggestion or request for you to consider is that we have them come in and they have the ability to sign people up on their phones. If people don't have phones, they'll have tablets with them, so people will have the device no matter whether they have one personally. They will work with Carrie on the delegate sign-in process. After talking to Gio about it, he had a couple of questions. It's doesn't have to be anonymous. So Gio was concerned that people would cast a vote and not have to be accountable back to their region that sent them in terms of how they voted. So I asked them today, do you have the ability to essentially record the results of a vote up on the screen? You can see who's voted, so you can tell whether or not a vote has been recorded, but also how they voted instantly. They also have the ability to live stream the meeting. So if you're thinking about remote participation, one thing you're going to want to know is, does it work in the room in Lake Maury to have a live video feed so that people can hear in real time the discussion and participate. Because the language you have in the bylaws says in order to participate remotely, you have to hear the conversation and be able to participate in it as it's happening. So I have no idea whether that's even possible. This is an opportunity to at least test some software to see how does that work. Recognize it's happening a little quickly, but because of, we only meet once a year, it felt like if we said, well, that sounds nice, we're gonna wait until next year, it just adds more time to your process in terms of thinking about how you wanna handle remote participation. So that's,
Kim?
So in that they're sponsoring the conference, are they letting us pilot for free?
cool.
And do they have a price tag that they would share with us, or are they charging?
I asked them what the cost would be, and I received a very vague, we'll work with you. Yeah, so, because we have not had this conversation, I didn't want to get too far down a road with them and let them think that there was some, even prospect of that being a future possibility. But what I did speak with them about was the notion that we don't have a lot of money to spend on this thing. So if it goes well, if they come and it goes well, then the board needs to have a discussion about the financials and that we don't have a lot of room within our budget. And he was clear that that was the context in which he was talking to us.
I have no problem trying something like this, especially if we look at it as a beta site test, and in order to do that, we would have to have a backup, a manual backup in case the electronic system didn't work. And I think if we present it that way, then after the meeting, we can go back to the full membership and say, oh, it worked out very nicely, or here were the problems, and this is how we foresee off-site participation on it.
So I'm trying to understand this. So we would be using their voting, their electronic voting at our meeting this year, and the meeting time and the time that we put into the meeting is the same as what we had planned before. And would there be remote voting?
So not
this-
remote voting,
Okay.
but you could observe.
But there could be remote participation, or at least remote viewing
Remote viewing.
so there won't be any interaction. I think my biggest concern about this is the time it takes for people to get the phone, going, I mean, I just asked Emily quickly, does that mean you have to have an app? And she said, no, you just go to a website, which I think makes it simpler, but you know how people are with their devices and all that. And I would be worried about the time being so limited and having a pretty busy annual meeting. It's pretty packed full of resolutions that we need to deal with, knowing that we always are short of time anyway. So that would have to be answered. I would hate to see, Carrie and everybody else, I'm sure they'll bring people with them to help, but that's
Yep.
the piece that sounds
So
really.
I think Emily raised that same concern.
Emily's-
How are we gonna do, manage this new process? We've got a new process for delegates and getting everybody online. And that we would plan to announce at the conference that this is happening and that registration actually starts. We could start it as early as a half an hour before the start time of the meeting, but that the expectation is you come early so that you make sure you're registered and brought up to speed in advance of the start time of the meeting. So our last activity is scheduled to end at 3:45, and the annual meeting starts at 4:15. So that's one option.
Would our membership, let's say something positive decides tonight, would our membership be informed before they arrive there?
Yes, so when we send out the FAQs, so we haven't distributed these electronically because I wanted to have this conversation so that we could alert people if you're not attending the conference and you want to participate, make sure you arrive early so that, that you can be registered and up, up to speed.
When you say participate at the conference, or we're talking about listening in and the discussion, but not voting in anything this year if you aren't there.
Right, the remote participation would be solely limited to observing, because our bylaws don't allow for participation.
Remote voting at
But it's
this
a
time.
test of the technology to see whether, from the user end, it works.
Kim?
So it's not an app, and I'm just thinking about everybody getting onto the website, but is there any way that when people check in that morning, or somebody who's a delegate at 4:15, when they check in at 8 something to get their package, are they able to register then?
That's a really good suggestion. I think, we could have somebody at the check-in table and with a sign, are you the delegate? And people could come that way. The only trick is we're not requiring people to announce who their delegate is. So it's.
But we might,
but
if
I
we knew
think-
we were gonna potentially do that procedure, we could send something out to the board chairs and let them know if you predetermine who the delegate will be when they register in the morning, they can also register for the annual meeting so that they know. And if not, you can also register before the annual meeting so that there are boards who are going to have made that decision and make them ready to do that. And that even if it saves you a few people, it saves you time.
Melanie,
Two questions. One is, do we know how many voters we have this year? How many supervising union districts?
About 60. We don't know who's, we're assuming everybody's gonna stay a member, so, it's possible we'll know of a few folks that said we're not paying dues this year by that point, but our assumption is 60 potential folks could show up ready to cast a vote.
Okay. I think absolutely we have to open it up right away, and I wonder is it too late to request people to announce their delegates? Because especially if we want to have voting in real time, half an hour isn't enough to register 60 people, get their names, get them entered in whatever the system is, and make sure that they can be accountable if you want to hold them accountable in that way. It absolutely, I mean, there's no way to do that in a half hour. You're talking 2 people a minute.
My sense is that they will have multiple people on site to help us, number one. I think Kim's suggestion is one that could prevent a big lineup. We are talking about doing it in a different room this year, so you're not in that tight hallway. So we could have a setup around the corner so that there's a flow to it. But I think it's too late to say you're required to assign a delegate, because number one, we just spent 2 regional meetings telling people they didn't have to do that. And the timing is tough in some places that don't have a supervisory union board meeting scheduled before the meeting. That means they can't vote. So again, I think this board talked about it in last month and decided not to do that. I think that's tough to do. But I do think we can over-communicate about the need to
Communicate.
yeah, about the need to, if you know who your delegate is, part of your sign-in process and you're going to the conference, part of your process of registering is going to be getting you ready for the annual meeting voting.
Ms. Simmons?
So I think there's a lot of concern about people logging into the system and it being very involved, and I know that part of the system of votes is to not have that. So there's not a login. They set you up with a card. So the system is set up to scan your driver's license if you're voting in like a municipal election. But for us, they would create cards that say like Delegate 1 through Delegate 60. It has a little scanner, you know those funny codes?
QR codes.
Yeah, QR code. That is one method they can use, and it's just a boop.
You're in.
Because this company didn't register people ahead of time for the Massachusetts Democratic Delegate Assembly. Like a convention center full of people voted using this method, came down the aisle, did it, and went back to their seat. So I don't want us to get really worked up about that. Also, think about they're coming to sell this to you to pay them to do it one day. They're going to make it work smooth. You know, like they have a financial interest.
Yeah.
We know what's good for them.
Yeah.
So let's take a couple more and then figure out if this is the direction we want to go in. Emily, do you want to say something?
Yeah, about the voting delegates, I haven't been at one of the regional meetings, and I'm not quite sure what we're saying, but regardless of whether somebody has, prior to the annual meeting, assigned a delegate from their SU or SD, they will only be allowed one vote anyway.
Right.
So, do we know whether that person will be just one person? Or do we know whether somebody might say, well, they're gonna vote on the resolutions, but I want somebody else to vote on the, I mean, you see what I'm saying? It can get really complicated, and one of the things that I love new stuff, and I especially love new technology. I think this is a fantastic idea. So it's a little unusual for me to be saying things like, watch out. But this is a really big change for our organization, our membership, this year, going from, and honestly, I've heard more feedback from board members about, and have had to explain over and over again why we went to this process and the loss of multiple votes into one vote for your SU. And people are pretty good when I explain it to them, but they are confused about it. I think that there's going to be some confusion even there, because I mean, not everybody's asking people about it, they're just upset. So I just add that caution on where there's a change in the way we're voting also, as opposed to just the change in the electronic piece as well. So it seems like a lot of layers for board members in a short period of time.
I think we gotta get the message out real clear. I can see, I'll take my instance. We had 3 new transitional boards that don't belong. 2 unified union districts and a supervisory union, of which none of them qualify to vote this year because they aren't going to be operational until July 1, 18. So the old supervisory unions get the opportunity to, or districts, Ken has 1 vote as a district, where most of the rest of us are still in our old configurations for another year that are going to be making this decision on who the vote is. And I think there's going to be some major confusion about that, like who are you?
BRSU.
No, but,
Art, Conic and Green?
yeah, but that doesn't count this year because it's not operational, right?
Right.
Right. But that board, I mean, I guess to counter that point though, that board is still within our SU. So half of our Taconic and Green is part of our BRSU system. It's still the same group of people. And we, as a Taconic and Green, are still part of that BRSU. So it's still the same people, it's still the same voices. In our situation, the SD I can see being different.
Even if
But
they're not
Tonic and Green
operational,
can't
they're
vote
still
to elect a
official.
delegate.
I think we got to,
They're not members.
I think we're getting into the weeds a little bit on this, folks. So, so I think it's kind of for these guys to
Better
manage
now
some
than
of
at the
these things.
19th though.
Clifton?
Well, I hear people talking about the potential logistical problems with this. To me, you know, our voting is a really sacred process, and we are changing the way it's being done, so school boards may not feel like they're being properly represented. So I don't know that there's any independent expert confirmation that comes directly to us, not through this vendor. And obviously, it's to their enormous advantage to be able to say that they did this with us, just like it is for them to be able to say they did it with the Democratic Convention. But first of all, I don't see that it saves us a huge amount of time. Being able to do this on our phone is very intriguing, but raising the cards, I mean, we've always gotten through that just fine. You know, without some independent confirmation that this will work, and Gio said, or Nicole said they could flash the results up so I could confirm, yes, I voted yes on this. But the tabulation is completely in the cloud. We have no way to confirm that. And I feel like that, you know, maybe it'll save us a little bit of time, but I think we risk something tremendous. Suppose it goes awry and suppose someone questions it. Whom do we know that can say absolutely that this resolution passed and can confirm that independent of this process. I feel like we're risking a lot for very little benefit.
Yeah.
I was recalling that I think Stuart suggested that we be running maybe the system parallel. Like, how hard would it be to click yes and raise your card? I'm not sure that that would not be something to
That's a great
consider.
idea, but if we're gonna do that, then why are we doing this?
Well, because I
Just for
think
their
we want to
benefit.
be able
This-
to, if we are next year wanting to offer the opportunity for people to fully participate remotely and be able to vote, we need to consider how that's happening. And I think, I'm not recalling myself, when votes have been closed and we've done a roll, are our minutes reflecting who's voting? Like, I'm thinking if it's popping
No,
up on
no,
the
just
screen,
numbers.
Cliff,
Yeah.
right, so,
Not
like, in
minutes.
this case, we actually have basically a voice vote and a roll and a record of who voted in what way, I think. So I'm not sure that I'm as concerned about is it gonna be accurate or accountable, because it feels as though it's gonna show up, and more so than who held up this card, I think, almost. But I wonder if there is concern that the technology is not gonna work. Is it hard for us to do both at the same time and recognize to people that we're trying this as one of the possibilities to consider how we get to an option a subsequent year to allow for more full participation remotely?
Okay. We need to be moving on here. We need to make a decision. Mary Kate?
So Kim expressed most of what I was going to say. I just wanted to emphasize that I think it's really important for us to move to being able to do an electronic meeting. We voted for that in our bylaw changes. I think our membership are looking to participate more, and by having this and having the parallel system, we can see, it gives us a dry run in terms of will it work, will it not work, what are the options going to be, and that information is important too.
So I don't see the necessity of taking a formal vote on this, but I would like to see if people would like to try this. I can take a formal vote too if people want one.
Can I just state that, just, I'm not trying to correct, but I'm saying what this board voted to change the bylaws to say, look into it, not to endorse electronic voting. I just think it's really important, and the membership is going to be able to say at this very meeting where we're going to do this, whether they want to be able to do that or not. It's a distinction.
Who wants to give this a whirl in some form? Who is against it or neutral towards it?
Do one, then the
If
other.
we can have a
Well,
backup.
let's allow our staff to figure out how to make this happen.
We'll bring the plastic.
You sure you want to do it?
So we'll have the backup.
I wrote myself a note, bring the colored sheets of paper.
Yeah. That,
And I did,
You're a
I
parliamentarian,
did
so I
ask
trust
that,
that.
how are we gonna have a verifiable, and I think what we could do, we don't record votes right now, we record the results. But we could ask for a printout, that would be part of the minutes, and viewable voting. So I actually think it could end up being more transparent and accountable, but, and I agree that we need to be upfront about how those concerns may be.
All right, collective bargaining update.
Okay, so, we have, the Health Benefits Commission, which, held its first meeting. I had tried to identify, potential, proxies or anybody but me, to represent the VSBA. Labor attorneys are out straight right now. Any school board member that is really, I think, up to speed with a lot of the issues is out straight. So I regretfully am your representative on the Health Benefits Commission. The Vermont NEA has appointed a UNISERV director, and the Superintendent's Association has appointed a superintendent from Barry. So the first meeting was really, so the governor appointed David Provo, who is the CFO or Vice President of Finance for Middlebury College. he comes, also had a long tenure at Champlain College as a finance director there. So he's, my observations of him are that he's well organized, able to run a meeting, asks good questions, makes sure the process moves along. It was essentially a educational meeting, so we heard from Brad James about the education funding system. We heard from Mark Hage and Laura on the VHI plans and the background, history of VHI, and we heard from the Department of Financial Regulation on the actuarial assumptions associated with the new plans. And then they heard from Vermont NEA on the status of bargaining. So Vermont NEA, what was also interesting was that the member that was appointed to represent the House of Representatives, when we went around and said who we were, she said she was there to represent Vermont NEA. So, so Vermont NEA has 2 seats on, according to the people who are at the table, 2 seats on the commission. The Senate appointed George Cross, who was a long-time House member, and he claims that he's not clear why he was appointed, but he's a troublemaker, for those of you who know George, and essentially wants to talk about single payer. Sounds like that's George's goal. Anyway, I have concerns. At the end of the meeting, the chair talked about wanting to get regular updates from Vermont NEA on how bargaining was going. So I have reached out to the governor's office and to David, the chair, to say, you know, that's not really an appropriate approach, that at the next meeting, which is next Wednesday, the commission really needs to hear from labor attorneys and or school board members who can provide a sense of what's happening on the ground from their perspective. I think the most useful piece of Jeff Fannon's testimony, which is essentially, we have problems, but they're created by Act 46 and Act 85, not, you know, in other words, in every other year, it's fine. There are no problems. That they did include information on who's settled, so, or the percentage of settlement. So less than half of the state has settled their contracts at this point, which is pretty remarkable, and creates a pretty big issue when you think about enrollment in the health plans needing to start this month. So the deadline VHI has set on November 15th, hard deadline. If your employees haven't enrolled in a plan, they're going to be put into the default plan. And under labor law, if you haven't settled a contract, the status quo doctrine will govern. So then it becomes a question for, likely to go at some point before the labor board, what constitutes status quo in an environment where the health plans you used to offer are no longer available. So I've been working with Joe Blanchette and labor attorneys on guidance to boards that haven't settled contracts. How do you manage these conflicting needs to, one, continue to negotiate in good faith under the law and follow the process under the law, and ensure your employees are able to enroll in a plan in a timely manner and that they know what the cost sharing arrangements are going to be. So I don't know if you're not a chair, you probably didn't receive the communication we sent out. We sent a communication to board chairs and superintendents outlining essentially the guidance that Joe and this group of labor attorneys came to. And Joe and I are presenting to the superintendent's all-members meeting next week to talk through that a little bit more. It's only so much I can put into an email and distribute widely, so we're hoping to have a little bit more of a frank discussion with the superintendents around these challenges. But basically, people are in a pretty tough position. We want to make sure that boards are requesting to reopen, if you've declared impasse, you're requesting to reopen, come back to the table, negotiate a side letter on health insurance. The board is, really has an interest in ensuring employees are able to enroll on time. The association refuses to come back to the table, or comes to the table and says that it's a non-starter. We're gonna follow the other process and let status quo kick in. The board might want to implement an interim plan and just say, it's important to us that we have, that our employees have information about what plan to enroll in, what the cost exposure is gonna be, and let the labor board sort that out after the fact. Because the fact is that a case won't get to the labor board until February, March, April. At that point, hopefully, contracts will be settled. And the board would be obligated to, if the settlement is retroactively beneficial to employees, that you would retroactively compensate. But we have some thoughts about what would be status quo. We think it's reasonable. We think it passes a straight face test. This is totally uncharted territory. We're trying to do our best to get people good information, but the best advice is work with your attorney. But do it quickly.
Yeah, so when are you meeting with attorney and superintendent?
I've already met with the attorneys. I issued the guidance on September 6th, and I'm meeting with the attorneys, or with the superintendents on the 21st, next Thursday. They're all members meeting. We've requested time set aside at the end of the meeting for people who have not settled contracts to meet with Joe and I. So that's that. Anybody have any questions? Recapture, there's been some rumbling about the agency's calculation not being, what people expected, or not supported by the plain language of the law. My view.
I want to tell us, just make sure everybody knows what recapture
Recapture,
is.
so that's the Act 85, it's not recapturing, we're not giving you the money we said we would give you when you passed your budgets.
This was the compromise.
The
65,
school boards get
35
thrown under the
split.
bus, Bill. No, but there are, some folks are surprised by the amount that was issued by the agency last month. They were required by the law to give everybody their number by August 15th or 14th, and they met that deadline. And what we have said is that if you have a question or issue, I haven't gotten these questions, superintendent Jeff has. And the response has been, if you have a problem with the calculation, you need to take that up with the Agency of Education. I think what happened was an earlier calculation didn't yield the revenue that they were hoping for. So they adjusted the calculation. I think that's all I want to say about collective bargaining.
Who was
Anybody have any
hoping,
questions?
about who was hoping for? It didn't yield the revenue that they were hoping for, you said. Who's that? Who's that?
Joint Fiscal Office
Oh,
apparently
okay, thank you.
intervened,
Okay,
which
thanks.
we have questions about the lawfulness of that. But it should be an administrative function to carry out the law once it's been passed. But side note, it's not on the agenda tonight. For those of you who are coming to regional meetings, you're going to hear a lot about this. But there's a $47 million structural deficit in the ed fund. So my view is you can fight the agency on the recapture amount and maybe get that adjusted somewhat, but no matter what happens, if the state does not recapture $13.5 million, then we just have a bigger hole next year to make up. So,
Do you have a question or comment?
I have concern about the makeup, not in your ability to represent us on that committee, but that in the same way that law came to be in the absence of practitioners on the ground doing the negotiating, sitting at the table across the table from those who are trying to collaborate with and come to agreement. I see that absence in that group, and I am being told that a broader plan will come out of something with so little practical input.
That's why I'm trying to get a lot of folks to come to meetings and testify before the commission, because I recognize that I'm not, and I'm on the commission there to evaluate the information. I'm not necessarily there to be piping up every 2 minutes to say, well, this is the school board experience. I mean, I will do that, but I am compromised somewhat in that I'm supposed to be there to evaluate what the options might be. Yes, it's a problem that we need to get around by ensuring that we have people come to the meetings and represent school boards and management.
All right, should we move on then? Independent school rules?
Yeah, so that committee has met several times. Emily's on the committee representing the House. Emily
This
Wong.
Emily, not that one.
We were supposed to have a meeting yesterday, it was canceled. But here's what's happened to date. We've had 3 meetings. The first meeting was sort of another get everybody up to speed meeting. The second one, we had a rather bizarre presentation on special ed law 101 that was totally off point and not on topic, so that was frustrating. And then the independent schools presented their.
Who presented that one?
Susan Marks, who was formerly an attorney for the Agency of Education, specialized in special ed. It was apparent to me and others of us on the committee that the agency had not properly prepared her for what content that group needed to hear about. It was a real waste, unfortunately, because she's very smart and would have been able to illuminate some of the issues, but she didn't cover the intersection of special ed law and the independent school landscape at all. So we learned a lot about IEPs. The more important thing that happened at that second meeting was the independent schools presented their sort of perspective in terms of who they are, who they serve, how they operate, and recommendations for how to proceed. And their recommendations included essentially accepting, not using open enrollment processes, but if the school determined with an IEP team that a student was a good fit for a school, given that school's mission, then they would accept that student, but the LEA would be responsible for staffing that school and student. So, yeah. So it's a sort of, we recognize that the discrimination issue is problematic. And the way we want to get around that is not by having independent schools obtain approval to provide special education services, because that is costly and burdensome. We will take the students that we think will be a good fit, even if they have a disability, as long as the LEA essentially staffs the school to serve that student. And they had some appeal process where the school, if the school said, no, we don't want to admit that student, but the IEP team felt it was a good placement for the student, that there would be like an independent, neutral body to determine, but that body had to consider the mission of the independent school. So they left it at that's their proposals, and we were asked to respond. Which I'm not crazy about the dynamic that's been created, because this was a State Board of Education initiated activity, a revision of the rules. The agency has been largely silent. The State Board didn't come to the last meeting, came late to the one before. So the chair, who's Senator Baruth, has essentially set up a dynamic of independent schools versus private schools. Make your best case. He's hoping to facilitate a grand compromise. He said at the second meeting, I want to have a unanimous vote on proposals that we're all going to agree to. So we spent a lot of time in our office determining how we were going to respond, because we felt like we were being put in a position of having to make the case for rule revisions that were being initiated by another body, and they're really the responsibility of the state, not our responsibility. And so we went around the barn a lot. We convened a meeting, the Superintendents and Special Ed Administrators Association, Jeff and Joanne, convened a group of administrators and special ed administrators and superintendents from regions that have school choice or relationships with independent schools to talk about what are some of the issues and use that discussion to inform our testimony, which I shared with you all. So the reason I wanted the board to weigh in here is because I'm getting the feeling that Senator Baruth wants to orchestrate some kind of compromise that would essentially have public school districts on the hook for increasing the capacity of private schools. And I think there's so we have participated in the creation of a really challenging dynamic, per usual. So we've, helped to shine a light on the problem with discrimination, right? You accept public funds, we have schools that accept public dollars that don't serve all kids. If the solution to that is, gosh, we need to fix this discrimination problem, but we're gonna do so by asking the public system to shore up the private system. My instinct in that is, heck no, we have a resolution that is really clear about essentially leveling the playing field between public and private. But I need a little cover from you all so that I can say, I'm not authorized to participate in that kind of a compromise. I think I'm on the right track and I see a lot of heads, but I need you to tell me that.
You can't do that. And Ken has spoken.
I want to ask a question, not to say that I am for that idea at all. However, is there some mechanism of that could be used to help us have some more accountability in the independent schools for the special education dollars? Because right now, when we're leaving it up to the independent schools to use those dollars, we don't really have that much of a say in how they're using them, who's providing the services, and what they charge for those services. So while we're still publicly responsible for the dollars, we have no control over it.
Right.
So that at least starts to, I know from the public perspective, we need some control over what's happening there. So there is something about that answer is not the right one, but there's something about that is somewhat appealing, and I'm wondering if that's a starting point to getting to that process of making sure that the public, that these independent schools, our LEAs are responsible for the kids anyway. So if they're in there and they're watching the process, is that such a bad thing?
Mm-hmm. So the testimony that we offered tries to cover a range of issues, and special ed billing and accountability for special ed funds is one of the issues, topics that we raised and recommendations that we have. I'm feeling like we actually did a fair amount of, I don't know about to say compromising, but creative thinking to address the concerns that were raised by independent schools and say, we are too small. If we have to become approved in every category of disability, that's going to put us out of business. So our recommendation recognizes that reality. By the way, that's the same reality public schools sometimes. We are losing small public schools in the state. But we're going to acknowledge that that is a problem and that we're not out to close independent schools. But that there's a role for the LEA and the state to help the independent schools increase their capacity if through an open enrollment process they enroll a child that has a disability for which they're not approved. So it's we care about the child, and we will figure out a way to have that child be able to attend that school in a timely manner. But we're not gonna take responsibility for staffing your school. So what I said at the committee meeting when we were talking about this is, it creates all kinds of supervision issues. In capacity, when you think about Act 46, which is really about how do we start to create more cohesive systems that allow for a more focused professional development, the ability to move staff. You know, when you talk about now, the expectation is that all gets blown out because you are going to need to staff. In some cases, your supervisory union has got numerous independent schools that in-state, out-of-state. So I think it just creates. It may, I think it sounds good, but the practical realities of what that would mean for a public school district are really challenging to swallow, given we're under so much pressure. And it seems like independent schools are essentially saying, but you can't put us under any pressure, that's too hard. It's like, well, yeah, that's the business of educating children and being accountable to the public. It's hard. So,
If I can just quote what Tom just said earlier tonight when he first spoke. When money follows a student to a charter, I think you were talking about charter schools, but in our case, independent school, when money follows, but it isn't the parents' money, it's the public's money, and there has to be some accountability through that process, and that's a big concern. I mean, it's the child needs to be thought of, and so does the public's dollar.
I have one concern here, that where we get 504 and special ed mixed up at the agency, I have absolutely no problem with paying a special ed bill to a private school. They document that this student is on IEP needs it. Tax dollars pay for that. There's no question about that. But 504 is a different matter. 504 says, it's been the law for 25 years, we have to accommodate some person to even the playing field. Not because they have a disability, but, well, they have a disability, but whatever 504 does, there's certain covered areas.
right.
And that's a cost of doing business, whether you're independent or whether the agency won't back a school district up on that. When I say, no, that's not our bill to pay, that's yours. And when we're paying $14,000 for secondary tuition and we get a $15,000 bill for 504 services for the same student, I say no and I get outvoted. The superintendent, well, I already agreed to sign the contract.
Yeah, so contracts
That's
are a
gotta
big
stop.
problem, and I think the Bennington-Rutland Supervisory Union has done a really nice job of highlighting some of these issues with billing and contracts and my goal, accountability, and my goal is to ensure that the committee looks at the memo that was submitted by Bank. I mean, I think it was included in the big packet of, here are all the things that were submitted to the state board, but we didn't talk about it. And I think we tried to incorporate some of those principles into our testimony. But I think, rather than participate in we give a little, they give a little, I would like to say our testimony and our recommendations, we're not going beyond that. Those are the final things that we can agree to. And we have an interest in just having the committee have more information, more testimony at this point, rather than using it as a negotiation session. So that, I think, is an important issue, and it's been highlighted by Melanie's supervisory union.
Just to put too fine a point on it,
Yeah.
when we say, I don't want to pay this, then the school that's in that district writes a letter to the parent and says, if the town decides not to pay it, we're going to expel the student.
Oh, yeah, they've got you where they want you. It's a
Well,
tough, the
I
power
found that their lawyer
dynamic
to
is
sue
very
them.
disgusting, challenging. I don't know where that came from. It's challenging because the contracts aren't good. The contracts aren't good, and we need to work on the contract.
We need to move on, but what we need is someone to make a motion to give Nicole the negotiating, or lack of negotiating ability, I think that's better, that she needs. So,
Just to endorse the testimony provided.
Resolution.
Yes.
Support our resolution.
Yeah.
so it's not just support the resolution, but that support that testimony.
Yeah.
So that, I think that's key, is that we can't see moving very far off that testimony. Something of that nature.
Can we do that though? I mean, that is not your role. Your role is to be observant on this board, right?
My
she's
role
being
on this
asked-
is that
Not
I've been,
this board.
this was a legislative
Not-
committee that was created to, I think the chair has created that dynamic.
Okay.
That he wants there to be some kind of negotiation. And what I want from this board is, we're not here to negotiate, we're not here to present our perspective. And it's the state's responsibility to figure out what to do with that. It's not our responsibility to come to an agreement with the private schools.
I'll make that motion.
So I'm gonna need specific words.
I would make a motion that Nicole is not authorized to negotiate in this committee, and that she is, strictly there to represent the testimony that's been provided. Or, I mean, I guess that would be, you are there to, I don't know, hear the testimony that's been provided.
And we have
Provided by the
submitted.
By the
VSBA, VSA, and
and
the
VSBA.
Present the testimony.
Second? Mary Kate seconds it. Any further discussion on that motion? Carrie, do you have it all?
No.
Motion, Nicole is not authorized to negotiate on the committee, but rather to present the testimony given by the.
To stand by the testimony offered
Like stand by,
by
right.
the VSBA, VSA, and VCSBA. Yeah, that works for me.
This is very unusual, by the way, that we're taking away negotiating ability instead of giving it to her. Any other further discussion?
I'm sorry, who was the second?
Kim?
I just want to make sure that it's clear, I know it's clear among us sitting here, but that means you are basically, our line in the sand is drawn. This is our proposal.
Right.
And it doesn't mean you lose voice in that, but rather that you don't have any space to cut deals.
Right.
Is- I
That's
just
my understanding.
want
of
you
this.
to not feel as though
You wanna
you are
read
not
that?
an active participant in those conversations.
Right. I will still participate.
I-
Yeah, I will know
assume
what
so.
the boundaries of that participation.
Carrie, you want to read that back? so we make
Yeah,
sure we
just
got
wanted
it?
to be
Motion
clear.
is that Nicole is not authorized to negotiate on the committee, but rather to stand by the testimony given by VSA, VCSE, and VSBA.
Any further discussion?
Could we put Kim's comments during the, the
In the discussion.
discussion of the motion, just to,
Get it off the tape.
Yeah, we have it on tape. Remember, everybody, this is being videotaped. Ken, that's new for you.
Where's the
It's right there. The last, right on YouTube.
You're on the
Oh
screen.
my God. I wore my best.
how many ties do you own?
I have one. Okay.
He wore it in the.
Yeah, you yeah.
I didn't recognize it when he showed up.
I didn't recognize it.
And every time I show up in the State House, it's the same time. All right, we got Kim's comments captured?
We will.
Yes.
Okay, all right, so all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Any abstentions?
I'm going to abstain. It's something I absolutely never do, but I think is appropriate in this case since I sit on the committee.
Emily abstains. All right, and so now we're at Agency of Education Capacity. This was put on by the request of a board member, I think, who's not here. Right?
There seemed to be a few people that were interested in it.
All right,
We
so-
have nothing prepared. Do you wanted to talk about it?
But I think the one in particular who brought it up is not here, so I don't know if, do we feel prepared to converse about this? The whole topic is how the agency is woefully underfunded and under capacity and can't be of much service.
That's the perception. I think what would be useful for us in understanding the concerns of the board is what experiences you have with agency capacity or what questions you have about agency capacity. It's a familiar narrative that they don't have capacity. We have our own observations and experiences, but it's useful for us if we know more about what your concerns and experiences are. If people aren't prepared to share that tonight, then
Well, I have a brief comment. It's a little bit troubling when we ask legal questions of the agency and we get a response, and at the bottom of the response it says the last phrase is, but you should check with your attorney. So I expect them, when we ask for opinion, I expect them to give it to us as something that we can rely on. And they also say that sometimes they're gonna check with you, which I feel like is not necessarily appropriate either. So that tells me that they don't have the staff they need, and particularly in this couple of years of intense legal crises for them to come up with the rulemaking and the changes in the legislature that followed Act 46. So that tells me that they're overstrained.
it could also be a cover their butt strategy. So
Well,
typically,
yes, but
you know,
I
we do
don't,
that
I don't
too.
expect that from a state agency,
Yeah.
a cover their butt strategy. We're relying on them. I think that's where the buck stops. They're the rulemaking authority. They should be able to tell us what's legal and not. And if they give us an equivocating answer, I think something's wrong. And I assume it's that they don't have the funds to hire the people they need to answer those questions accurately.
Okay.
So I have an answer to that. So a lawyer's rules of ethics that you have to follow or you'll get disbarred keep you from fooling people even accidentally into thinking you have an attorney-client relationship. So
Yeah.
I have the same disclaimer in my email to say you should check with your own legal counsel to make it abundantly clear to people that I'm not your attorney, and if you have other questions and you feel like you haven't gotten good advice, you should seek your own counsel. So that's every attorney who does not have clients in an office.
Well, so then, we'll just say a little bit more about that, Emily, about when we're asking for a ruling from them, for example, and they don't actually give us one. They kind of give us an opinion rather than.
So the legal counsel at the agency who's working on governance for Act 46 exclusively is, I think the design is to save you money, much like my position, to call and get some informal and good experienced legal advice, not as your attorney. So information about the law, not applying it to your fashion that you go in and ask a judge to stamp. So it's probably Donna, and she is giving general guidance, but if it were to come down to you suing the Agency of Education, she does need to say that was not, I was not staking my law license on the line to say that. That was me being helpful, which is, I think, the only way you could structure that role.
And I do think that there is a provision under the law where if the district wants a formal legal opinion,
An agency ruling
an
is, yeah.
agency ruling, there's a more formal process for that.
Okay.
If it's just, we want to know what your answer to this question is, then it may be that you're getting that type of a disclaimer,
Okay.
that at the end of the day, you know, you're gonna have to work with
So I think we're diving deep into that one thing. What are other things that we have?
I got to agree with Clifford. We were sitting at the same meeting, and Nicole was giving a training, and it was painfully obvious to the people sitting around the table, including the superintendents, that a lot of this stuff on Act 46, the agency still intended to be quite clueless about. This late, that's just wrong. Donna's a nice person, and I'm glad she's finally in that role. But that's a day late and a dollar short, I'm sorry. Did you see it the same way?
Well, I did. I mean, what Emily says, that particular language, changes my opinion somewhat, but I felt the same way that you did. I felt like there was, there's been a lack of clear direction from the agency. And so we've waited a long time and not been able to act and go forward. I mean, the very fact that you had to organize that meeting, demonstrates that there was a lack of information. Because we really, 8 months ago, we wanted answers to this so we could go forward with planning our transition. And ours has been very painless and simple.
Any other observations about the agency? Mary Kate?
Yeah, on the piece regarding the quality standards, that, I just think that's been important to our work, and they clearly don't have the resources to put that together and create that, and so it's gonna be difficult in the context of Act 46 and beyond Act 46 to evaluate how schools are doing on quality standards.
I'm not so clear whether it's a timing issue with their ESSA plan getting approved and capacity. I think the good news about the feds approving the ESSA plan is that they can use those federal dollars allocated to the agency to support staff positions to implement that work. So I think they were hesitant to staff up, not knowing whether they could use federal funds to support those positions, but it remains a concern. We'll sort of believe it when we see it.
Kim?
That was exactly, word for word, thank you.
So
Every aspect.
maybe it's more effective to, for the next time we meet, to put in the packet that send something around to the other board members to say, start thinking about this. And I think more might come to light as people think about it, rather than putting people on the spot tonight. So.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it was somebody's request to talk
Right.
about, we weren't quite sure.
Right, so let's include this, think about it, take it back to your boards, and see if they can, wrestle up anything and come back and then have another discussion on it.
I was just going to suggest the exact same thing. I think it's really important we reach out to our regions about this. I think this is a significant issue, and I think it could be a significant issue. And if there are issues out there that people are having with the agency being understaffed, then we need to know.
Okay. Kim?
I think we want to put some context on that request for information. It might imply we're in a position to solve the problem, where the prioritizing that above other resolutions taken regarding staff, other matters. So I just would want to put it in context as an information gathering and just be sensitive to ending up owning the problem for being the
So another commission that would be on?
I agree, but just asking, it sounds like we're going on a witch hunt.
Yeah, I mean, and frankly,
Right.
superintendents have a lot more knowledge and experience with what's happening in terms of their needs that aren't being met and/or experiences with the
Let them take the lead on that.
agency. Yeah, and they've got they're reluctant to do that because for other reasons we can get into next time we talk about it.
All right. So let's move on then. Strategic plan monitoring, that's the grid system there in your packet. Is there any questions on that, or do people want to speak to that from the staff?
So I don't really have anything to,
This section here.
Lot here. Board development is obviously a little on the lighter side because Susan's been here 2 weeks. But she's really been hitting the ground, working on the video explaining our education funding system. And
Just a small thing for your first project.
Nellie May grant to support technical assistance on community engagement and some other things. But I think really what we were hoping to do on this agenda item is to get your approval of the priorities for moving to this coming year. So if you'll recall, we're in the second year of a 3-year strategic plan. And at the retreat, you all identified some priorities for this coming year. So I'm going to hand it over to Emily to explain what she did.
Yeah, so remember at the retreat when we had the sticky note exercises, we had 2 of them. One was about the agenda for world-class education. There was a second one about our strategic plan, and your sticky was your priority for where you thought it was going to be most important to work this year. At the August meeting last month, we gave you a summary of just a printout of the stickies. I typed them up. So the next step that I took it forward was I took our strategic plan and looked for where the wording of the sticky aligned with either an indicator or a strategy across the, 5 areas of our 5-year strategic plan. and bolded and underlined the ones that correlated to your sticky note priorities. There was a really big priority when we had a lot of conversation about engaging with the members more and utilizing the position of regional rep to do more outreach. That wasn't in our existing strategic plan, so on the first page under education leadership, I added a new indicator that's bold and underlined. And I added a corresponding strategy, the last one, that's bold and underlined. So I just wanted to call your special attention to those because that's new wording in the strategic plan, but we didn't have a place that talked about regional, reaching out. So it's pretty evenly spread, except that I don't think there was one for internal management.
So just to summarize or contextualize, that you've adopted the strategic plan already. The question is, does this accurately reflect the discussion at the June board meeting? I think this becomes a good tool for staff to remind ourselves, these are the areas that the board is really interested in receiving information about this year. We want to make sure we're setting aside time at board meetings to talk about. And the only addition is membership engagement, because that was a big focus and wasn't really in the strategic plan.
The only request I might have that goes along is when we get that request coming out of this office, it comes to the regional reps to pass this stuff on to the chairs. If it could just be an automatic procedure to attach the chairs list to every email, because that changes from our district one to the other without having to go find the last one and use local knowledge to try to see who's still there and who's not. If whatever you have currently, if you could just
We
tack
talked
that
about
on,
that after it went out.
that would be helpful to me anyways, when
And it's always changing, so that's the
so
thing.
every time one of those comes out, it would be really nice if I could pull up that block of addresses for my area.
Kim?
So in our region, and I don't know, and I'd be interested to know if it's the same for you guys, knowing a couple of the boards, the chair, vice chair, and clerk, that we may be more apt to see one or the other at a regional meeting than the chair necessarily. And so in the last distribution I did chair, vice chair, and clerk if they were naming themselves in the distribution. I looked at their websites and found them. And I don't know whether or not that makes sense all the way around, because we now have fewer boards. So where an SU used to have several board chairs that were getting the information, and then the SU had the information more than once. These larger districts have only one person getting the information. For instance, I'm on the negotiating committee, and I didn't get the negotiating information. So I just wonder if there is a different practice. I don't know.
Can I say this? I would not always count on the websites being correct.
Absolutely.
They're
I was
actually
trying to
more
figure out
likely
what I knew
incorrect.
about the people in my region when I was crafting it. But
They're
I'm
more
wondering if that
likely
would
incorrect
be,
than they are correct.
do people think that that would be a good practice in general when we're reaching out to our regions? Or that we are comfortable that it's just going to be one person on a larger board potentially?
So the proposal is to increase the audience or the names that you have for your region to chair and vice chair and clerk, were you saying? Or-
Well, I'm thinking about the people who showed up in the meetings, and I
Yeah.
think of, like, the CBU person was the clerk.
Right.
And those are the people you see more regularly, which may or may not be the chair. So,
Right.
I don't know. And I know, like, Jim Denise does their agenda planning together as an executive committee. We do as an executive committee. So I don't know if that's what's happening across the state or if it's unique to Chittenden County or what people think.
Pretty sure everything's unique to just.
I knew I opened myself.
You sure did.
As it was coming out of my mouth, I knew it. Thank you for making sure it was right.
Melanie, then Emily.
Why wouldn't we just send it to all members in a region, blanket, instead of just the chairs? Because I wonder if that just creates another filtering system, as in it's coming through me instead of from you. And then it goes to the chairs, who then send it out to their people, and they may or may not really understand what the discussion is either. So I recognize it makes us kind of the point person for this discussion, but isn't that kind of the goal anyway? And I know it may be a very large list, but maybe the chairs just isn't enough. And I know I've had members approach me and say our chair really is kind of de facto, and could you send it to me also? So that can't be the only board that.
I think that I think more than just the chair is important, and like, as long as we don't get to be junk mail for people because they're getting stuff from a bunch of different sources, figuring out how we best get reminders out that are the regional reminders versus the blasts that you guys do as well. So I don't know what that answer is, but I definitely would support anything from, executive committee to full list.
I'll just
Over
say,
a
that's
single
gonna be, it'll be a lot easier on our end to just send it to everybody, rather than ask Carrie to keep a current list of chair and vice chair.
Who doesn't?
It's hard enough, I think, to keep the
The only other thing I'm thinking of, if we started as regional reps, getting feedback of diverging opinions from a single board, for instance, or when we think about even how communications happen within the board, often they come back through a chair.
I don't get anything from anybody, so.
No, I don't get anything from anybody either. and I'm
Even one
not
or
a
two
chair, I'm
single
not a
ones
chair.
would be great.
So I don't.
Doesn't
but
have to be through a chair.
Any feedback. You're right, absolutely.
Anybody,
And I think
anybody.
I'd rather have us fix that problem after, get too much feedback, and then fix where is that? Are we getting like two different extreme positions from the same SU, and somewhere they're gonna have to reconcile that, and it's not my job.
Right, and the response is,
But I
we should
would
take this back to your chair and
rather
see what they
get
think.
more information than less, and
Yeah.
even fix that problem.
You had something.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, so Ken's probably been on this board longer than me, but this is a perpetual problem. We've had this conversation pretty much every year. I mean, and Carrie knows, she's dealt with this for a really long time. I have great concerns about chairs not sharing or even mentioning that they got an email. I don't know whether regional reps are saying right at the top of their email when they send to chairs, please distribute this to your boards or whatever, but that should, if we're going to go through chairs, that should be like in bold at the top and the first order of business.
I think it's the only thing I write. And then
But I've never.
So the lateness of the hour, let's bring this up next meeting and talk about this some more and see if this is something we want to do. But I don't think we want to tackle this tonight and spend 10 minutes on this.
Could I just tell that one quick, following up what Emily said, and forgive me, somebody already said it, what if we include superintendents?
Right, so let's bring that up, let's talk about it next meeting. We'll put it on the agenda.
Yeah, so
Okay.
I think what we do at the next meeting in November is we have an orientation for new
Right.
board members, and we talk about the role of the regional rep.
Let's put
So
that in.
we'll work on some strategies to ensure you guys
But
have the information.
For now, I need a motion to accept the changes in the strategic plan.
To adopt the
So moved.
FY18 priorities.
Thank you. That's what I need.
I second.
So who's first? Clarence?
I'm sorry, you said motion to adopt the,
FY18 strategic plan priorities.
That's what I said too. I said that. Very clearly heard that.
who was the motion?
Clarence made the motion, Amy Mullins seconded it. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposition? Any abstentions? All right, it passes. So consent agenda. We'll take a motion on that. Kim moves it. Second by Stewart. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Anybody opposed? Any abstentions? That passes as well. Under new business, I know Ken has something.
Oh, just a personal note, many of you, some of you anyways, know my lovely bride, Kate, former First Lady of Vermont. And we make note of the 13th of every month, which is today. Today marks 465 months since our first date.
Wow. That's impressive.
It's amazing.
The only one on earth who would do it.
Well, but it's also amazing to me, given how well I know Ken, that she's still with him.
She's very tolerant.
Underwater.
Very tolerant. I've gone a lot, you know.
All right, I have something under new business, like a couple things. One thing is we're still looking for potential new board members in Mary Kate's region. So if anybody knows anybody in the Addison area that's, might be pretty good. And Clifton's region as well.
I'm sure we'll have.
Yeah, Flora's been looking, but Clifton, if you have anybody that comes to your mind, that'd be great to pass them on to me, and I'd be happy to contact you.
In Bennington, but not that,
And
down
Bennington
there in
as well,
Albany.
but we just had the meeting there last night, so we have an open seat there now. And we have some board members who won't be with us. This is our last meeting of this board cycle. Keith is not with us tonight, and Jackie Prue is not with us tonight, so they're leaving the board. And Clifton's going to leave the board as well. Thank you for everything. How many years?
Thank you.
And Emily. How many years, Emily? No, that the tall Emily.
Is there something I don't know?
You guys are gonna keep her, and you hold on to her as hard as you can.
How many years, Emily?
I was just
You
trying to
keep-
tell Tom, I literally don't know,
You
but
gotta
it's been
think
over
about
10.
this, because it's okay, so.
I've worked with a lot of other presidents, and I've been through several executive directors. I came in under John Nelson, but I don't remember.
First time or second time?
So I think,
Second time.
I personally am gonna miss having Emily around, because she's been a mentor to me. And I'm gonna miss, no offense here, Tom, but I'm gonna miss our snide comments during the NSBA. events.
It is actually gonna be something I miss more than anything. It's a very diverse country we live in.
But you've been great to be on board with, and you're gonna be missed. Ken, did you?
Well, I've always looked up to Emily.
He can't say that.
I took a course in college on the Bible, believe it or not. And the Bible is literature, and there's a short group of books in the Bible that you don't see in your King James Version called the Apocrypha. It's between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And we were asked to pick out a favorite quote. And mine, if I can recall it, was from Ecclesiasticus, I think 6:36 in the Apocrypha. And it says, if thou seest a man of knowledge, or in this case a woman, the Bible's a little chauvinist sometimes. if thou seest a man of knowledge, get thou betimes unto him, and let thy footsteps wear a path to his door. And that's how I've always thought of Emily. She just is so clear thinking. Things that I wrestle with or things that I hadn't even considered, it seems just clearly apparent to her. Well, Ken, we need to focus on this and ensure that happens. And when she says it, it's like, that's so obvious. Well, why did I say that? But
I wish it were so obvious.
she's just done it year after year, and it's really been a pleasure working with you.
Thank you, Ken. I appreciate that. I'm going to miss this board. I miss these board meetings, but I am not going to miss all of you because I'm going to see all of you, I'm sure.
Bringing them in to testify.
I'm counting on you guys coming in to testify. We don't want to see Nicole over and over again or Emily over and over. We want board members in. Please.
All right. Well, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Kim seconds it. All those in favor, please stand up.